My name is Al Gedicks. I'm the Emeritus Professor of Sociology, University of Wisconsin, Crosse, and I'm here to talk about the potential for a nuclear waste dump in Wisconsin. And the reason for this urgency is that the legislature passed a law repealing Wisconsin's 33-year-old nuclear moratorium in April. And what that meant was that the protections in the legislation, which required the existence of a federally licensed and operated nuclear waste repository, was one of the conditions of the nuclear moratorium, that unless a utility could demonstrate that there is a federally licensed nuclear waste repository, they would not be eligible for a nuclear power plant license. The other condition is that the proposal would not burden ratepayers with excessive utility costs. So, and here's the essence of what we're talking about. This is a problem which has been ignored for the past 70 years. Every decision that's been made by the nuclear industry has been made to promote the production and dissemination of nuclear weapons at the expense of every other consideration: environment, health, and worker safety. The urgency of the issue in Wisconsin is illustrated by this map. We have thousands of tons of spent nuclear fuel being stored at reactor sites around the United States, despite a 1982 promise by the federal government to dispose of the wastes. And here's a distribution of the largest concentrations of spent nuclear fuel in the storage pools, temporary storage pools at nuclear power plants. Notice right in the center here in Illinois is the largest single concentration of spent nuclear fuel. The long-term strategy of the federal government is to move these temporary waste storage facilities into a consolidated federal underground repository. Given the volume of nuclear waste in Illinois, given the proximity of Wisconsin and the likelihood of granite being the desirable location for nuclear waste, the odds are that Wisconsin is going to be high on the list for a federal underground granite-based nuclear waste repository. This is very bad news for people that are concerned about their health and the environment, because these nuclear wastes contain radioactive elements like strontium-90, which is a bone-seeking radioactive element absorbed by the body, not excreted, continuing to emit radiation, and over the course of decades, or even a single 10-year period, capable of generating chromosomal changes in the human body and causing cancer, birth defects, which can be passed on from one generation to another. And here's a chart indicating that one of the primary targets of radionuclides or nuclear materials are the reproductive organs of the female, which of course have grave implications for birth defects both in the present and in future generations. Strontium, like strontium, cesium is also a potent carcinogen. Again, it's absorbed by the body. It concentrates in the muscle tissue and in the ova of females. And then, of course, the big concern in terms of its toxicity is plutonium, which is the most lethal carcinogen known, and single particles of it can produce lung cancer when inhaled. And, of course, all these spent fuel assembly rods have plutonium in them, because in the fission process, plutonium is created during the course of producing nuclear power. All during the first 6 decades of nuclear power, the issue of nuclear waste disposal has been a low priority, if non-existent priority, of the nuclear industry. And so we've been accumulating this waste over time, and one of the consequences is that we've had repeated radioactive releases from the irresponsible management of nuclear waste by state, private, and federal agencies. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 directed the Department of Energy to locate and construct a single repository for existing or for the existing nuclear waste in the spent fuel pools around the country, but also realizing that even if we had a primary site, there would not be enough room in a place like Yucca Mountain for all the waste, so they needed a secondary site, and that's why Wisconsin was on the list of the Department of Energy for a second repository. And this is in a granite or crystalline bedrock, and Wisconsin was one of 5 areas in Wisconsin, or there are 3 areas in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin ranked as one of the top 5 sites for a second repository. And there are 3 areas in Wisconsin that have granite bedrock outcroppings around the Wolf River and in the Hayward and Ashland area in northern Wisconsin. The most likely target, because of the extensive area involved and the extensive granite formation, is the Wolf River batholith, located in the middle of the Wolf River watershed, which contains the reservation lands of 3 tribes, Stockbridge, Muncie, Menominee, Ho-Chunk, and includes the ceded territory of 6 bands of Lake Superior Chippewa, in addition to encompassing a 1,000 square mile area, which includes Langlade, Shawano, Wapaka, Menominee, Portage, Marathon, and Oconto counties. Somewhere within this 1,000 square mile area, the Department of Energy would love to locate a permanent underground nuclear waste repository. Numerous studies of the Wolf River batholith have shown extensively fractured rock, which contains substantial groundwater flow, which would move radioactive waste from any repository into the entire watershed. The site is unsuitable, and all you have to do is look at the ecology of the area around the Wolf River watershed. It's full of lakes, streams, and rivers, which are intersecting with underground rivers that enter into the Wolf River batholith and exit the Wolf River batholith, which means any radioactive waste placed in the Wolf River batholith has the possibility of migrating outside the boundaries of the batholith. Wisconsin citizens and Indian tribes were overwhelmingly opposed to becoming nuclear guinea pigs for the Department of Energy. In 1983, there was a statewide referendum in which 89% of the citizens voted against a nuclear waste disposal site in Wisconsin. This is 1983, the same year that the legislature enacted the Wisconsin Nuclear Moratorium Bill, reflecting widespread public opposition to the siting of a nuclear waste repository. After massive citizen and tribal opposition to public hearings in the area of the Wolf River batholith, the Department of Energy postponed work on a second repository and left the state in 1986, a direct result of organized citizen tribal opposition to the project. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act amendments of 1987 eliminated the requirement for a second repository, and at that point all attention was focused on the Yucca Mountain site in Nevada, which would be the primary nuclear waste repository. And as is so often the case in the history of nuclear energy, the first victims of nuclear policy are Native American people, who are at both the front end of the cycle. Their lands have been contaminated by uranium mining, which is the essential ingredient for nuclear power. They've been the most bombed nation in the world. In the Nevada test site, the Shoshone and the Paiute people have suffered the consequences of radioactive fallout from being the targets of nuclear weapons tests that have resulted in massive contamination of air, water, and the people in the area of the nuclear weapons tests. And so we have not only the Western Shoshone and the Paiute, but all the downstream and downwind inhabitants in Utah, Nevada, Colorado, that are still suffering the effects of the fallout from those 1950, 60, and 70 nuclear tests. In this Department of Energy map, it shows explicitly that as part of the study area for the Nevada Yucca Mountain test site, they identify cultural resources for the tribes, the Southern Paiute, and the Western Shoshone. Senator Lindsey Graham famously made a statement that the Yucca Mountain was ideally suited for a nuclear waste repository because no one lived there. No one lived there except the Shoshone Nation and the Paiute Nation. This is a cross-section of what an underground repository would look like. In 2008, the Department of Energy revived the study for a second repository and listed Wisconsin as one of the top potential sites based upon our granite geology. This is what a spent fuel pool looks like in a nuclear power plant. This is what is the problem. These spent fuel pools are over capacity. They are trying to cram more and more radioactive rods in these fuel pools because they don't have anywhere else to put them, because they had planned that by the 1980s, and particularly 1988, Department of Energy would have a permanent nuclear waste repository at Yucca Mountain, and therefore they could continue to produce nuclear power and nuclear waste without any problems. The problem was that the repository was never created because of all the problems that have occurred unanticipated at Yucca Mountain. And I'll talk about some of those in a second. April 1st, 2016, several months ago, Governor Scott Walker signed a bill that allows new nuclear power plants in the absence of a federally licensed facility for high-level nuclear wastes. The Department of Energy now has even more reason to consider Wisconsin as a potential site because they've got a green light from the legislature, the governor, and public officials in the state of Wisconsin. And these are all people either from the governor's office, the Nuclear Energy Institute, which is the primary lobbying agent for the nuclear industry, which has targeted Wisconsin as one of the key states in which to knock down a nuclear moratorium so that 14 other states which have the same stringent conditions would also be targets to overturn nuclear plant moratoriums. And one of the most important boosters of this initiative to overturn the nuclear moratorium is the University of Wisconsin, which is a member of the Nuclear Energy Institute and also a recipient of massive Department of Energy funds for to design a small-scale modular experimental nuclear reactor worth millions of dollars in contracts and fees for the Nuclear Energy Department at University of Wisconsin-Madison. As I said in the very beginning, since Illinois has the most reactors of any other states in the eastern half of the United States, moving these lethal waste is expensive and dangerous. It is highly likely that either Wisconsin or Minnesota will make the final cut for any dump chosen. The only existing nuclear waste repository based upon the geologic concept of underground disposal is in the state of New Mexico around Carlsbad at the Waste Isolation Pilot Project. This is the site where the most deadly nuclear waste from the weapons program has been stored. And in 2014, this underground storage facility released plutonium, the most deadly radioactive element on Earth, and other radioactive elements because one of the canisters that held this material exploded underground. Not only did it explode underground, but it made its way up 2 miles from an underground storage facility into the atmosphere, contaminating 22 workers at the site who inhaled deadly doses of radioactive plutonium. That site was shut down in April of 2014 and has not been opened, and it is not expected to be opened anytime soon. And this, of course, this warning comes from Robert Alvarez, who knows his nuclear material science. He's the former Assistant Secretary of the Department of Energy. What he said, what makes this event so disturbing is that radiation went half a mile up the shaft into the open environment and contaminated people on the surface of the facility. Other countries which have rushed to implement a nuclear waste disposal concept without adequate scientific information include Germany. And here we have an underground facility in Germany at the Oss, northern Germany, in an abandoned salt mine, the Oss mine. The walls, they didn't do adequate studies of the geology and the rock stability of the mine. Ahead of time, they were in such a rush to meet the demands of new nuclear energy and requirements for a disposal site that they dumped all these barrels in the mine, and now the mine is collapsing. The walls of the mine are unstable. They're collapsing into the radioactive waste, and now there's an urgent public health emergency in Germany because they have to essentially rescue these 126,000 drums of plutonium-bearing radioactive waste before that waste gets into the environment. And the problem is that in order to rescue or excavate the radioactive waste from the collapsing mine, they are in danger of further destabilizing the rock structure and making the problem worse. And the most recent radioactive disaster occurred at the Hanford site, which is the site of the plutonium weapons production factory in the state of Washington. There was a leak at the Hanford site in Washington in April of 2016, just several months ago, and the nuclear watchdog in the area, Columbia River Keepers of Oregon, said, "This is another reminder of the cost of nuclear waste and the unexpected outcomes of handling radioactive material." This is the primary site for weapons production in the United States. And if you've been following the historic visit of President Obama to Hiroshima last month, what was not very well understood as he commemorated this horrific act of dropping a nuclear weapon on a civilian population is at the same time as he's calling for the elimination of nuclear weapons, his administration is funding a new generation of nuclear weapons to the tune of $1 trillion over the next 30 years. These weapons would be both modernized and miniaturized because the Department of Energy and the Pentagon thinks that if the nukes are smaller, they would be more likely to be used in a conflict situation. This is the utter edge of insanity, and this is from a president who has got the Nobel Peace Prize for his statement that we are in favor of abolishing nuclear weapons. He is doing the exact opposite. So, where are we today? We are here at the Department of Energy's new initiative called consent-based siting, because throughout the history of nuclear power, there has been no consent. The Department of Energy has made unilateral decisions regardless of the welfare, the health, and the economies of the people and the communities where these waste facilities have been located, whether they be nuclear power plants, uranium mines, tailings piles, nuclear waste disposal sites, weapons testing sites. All of those elements of the nuclear fuel chain have been unleashed against an unsuspecting public and tribal populations, and now they are saying that now for the first time we need to have the consent of people if we want to do anything with nuclear power. And so they have this so-called consent-based siting process, and there are hearings taking place next month in Minneapolis. There were hearings in Denver, Washington, D.C. To get public comments, except at the first hearing in Washington, D.C., the public wasn't allowed to speak. All they could do was hand in index cards with their concerns on them, and if the moderator felt that this was a legitimate question, they read the question to the panel, but there was no dialogue between the Department of Energy and the public. This is what we can expect from a consent-based siting process. In other words, new public relations, new language to confuse and deceive people about what's really going on. The ultimate objective is to continue the production of nuclear weapons and to do that under the guise of providing safe, reliable energy, which is non-existent and never has been as part of the history of the nuclear industry. So the problem is consent-based siting for nuclear waste dump has not been defined, and it may not ever be defined. It will be whatever the Department of Energy says it is. A Department of Energy spokesperson said consent could mean different things in different places under different circumstances. In 1995, the Navajo Nation passed a uranium ban on any uranium or any other nuclear activity on the Navajo reservation. And despite the ban, the Department of Energy is going ahead with plans to mine around the Grand Canyon where there are untapped uranium deposits to facilitate this expansion of nuclear weaponry at the labs in New Mexico, like Sandia and Los Alamos National Lab. And of course, the argument that nuclear energy is safe made by people at the University of Wisconsin every day, especially the Nuclear Engineering Department and the Robert La Follette the Environmental Studies Department at the University of Wisconsin. All of these so-called environmentalists are saying this is a new generation of nuclear energy, it's safer, more reliable, and they never address the question, how is it possible to generate nuclear power without contaminating more land, water, and air on Indian reservations where the uranium is located? It's not just in the United States, the same thing occurs anywhere where you have indigenous populations. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all these places which are the primary producers of uranium are indigenous lands which have been consistently violated from the very beginning of the nuclear age and continue to be targets of nuclear and environmental racism. That if the Native people can say no, then other communities can say no as well. And in fact, that was the impetus for the nuclear power plant moratorium of the 1980s, where there was some respect for the local opposition to nuclear waste siting in the Wolf River Batholith, and as well as in Ashland and Sawyer County area, which resulted in Wisconsin's historic nuclear power plant moratorium. Now, since the legislature is not willing to respect the wishes of the people, that doesn't mean that local communities can't enact bans on disposal of nuclear waste. And just last week in Grant Township in Pennsylvania, there was a community that put a ban on the disposal of fracking waste because it contaminated ground and surface water in this Pennsylvania farming community. And the state of Pennsylvania is not going to recognize the ban, and so the community has said that any attempt to interfere with any citizen that engages in civil disobedience to support and protect this ban is going to be prosecuted by the local township. So if you want to stop nuclear power, then the way to stop it is at the most grassroots, the most local level, to pass your own ordinances which ban the production, distribution, generation, disposal, testing of nuclear waste or nuclear power. Last March, we had the 5th anniversary of the Fukushima nuclear catastrophe in Japan. People thought that after 5 years, the crisis is over. In fact, what's going on in Fukushima is that they're still dumping radioactive waste into the ocean. And that radioactive waste is making its way across the entire food chain to the West Coast and contaminating the entire ocean environment. Now, we have the best minds in the country and in the world that have addressed the question of how to stop the contamination of Fukushima, and none of those minds has been able to come up with a solution. So I don't claim to be any smarter than those people that can't come up with a solution. So my solution is that we stop the production of nuclear power and nuclear waste, and then we can have some time to figure out a solution. But as long as we continue to produce nuclear power, we're never going to have a solution, because the people that produce nuclear power could care less about what happens to the waste. The Dan sisters, who are Western Shoshone grandmothers, have traditional rights to the grazing lands around the Nevada test site, or not, but in the vicinity of the Nevada test site, and they were cited by the Bureau of Land Management for overgrazing and threatened with confiscation of their entire horse herd. And of course, this was in direct violation of the Treaty of 1863, Treaty of Ruby Valley, which provided for the sovereign recognition of the Western Shoshone over those lands. They refused to pay any fees because it was their land. The Department of Energy, or not the Department, but the Department of the U.S. Marshal Service, the FBI, and the SWAT teams descended upon the Dan ranch. They rounded up the horses. They brutalized the Dan sisters, the grandmothers. They took the horses away, sold them to a private horse stable where the horses died of starvation. This is how concerned the Bureau of Land Management was with the rights of the horses and the dams. But the upshot was that this land is directly the land is directly above a major gold deposit which mining companies want to excavate, and immediately after the dams were disposed of, taken out of the picture, mining expanded in the Nevada gold belt. And so the Western Shoshone are not only victims of nuclear contamination, but also of cyanide and heavy metal contamination from the largest gold mining district in the world. These activities usually go hand in hand. The nuclear industry and the mining industry operate in a similar way and have violated all throughout the course of the history the rights of Native people. I mean, the entire nuclear industry is dinosaurs, the economic dinosaur. There are no private investors that are willing to invest in nuclear power because it's so dangerous and risky and unprofitable. The head of Exelon, which is the largest utility in Illinois, has said several years ago that they're not going to invest in any nuclear power plants. And the only reason that plant was shut down was because Exelon failed to get the ratepayers of Illinois to subsidize the continued operation of a failing and uneconomic nuclear power plant. And this, of course, is the same in Wisconsin. We've had the Kewaunee plant shut down. The Point Beach plant is still operating, but the La Crosse boiling water reactor was shut down decades ago. All those plants that were shut down still have on-site storage of nuclear waste that is unsafe. If there were a terrorist attack, all they have to do is breach the spent fuel pool, and there'd be a catastrophe as great as Fukushima. I mean, the radioactive material in those spent fuel pools is the most deadly stuff on Earth. And those facilities are not secure from any kind of terrorist attack, which, of course, is on the agenda of all sorts of groups in the world. Well, after the 1980s, the Ashland area sort of dropped out of the picture, and the most recent study from Sandia Labs, which is the primary Department of Energy contractor, has listed Wisconsin granite, which means the Wolf River batholith, as the most favorable of all the sites studied. So in the 1980s, Wisconsin was one of 5 granite structures that were on the list of the Department of Energy, but the most recent study, in the aftermath of Yucca Mountain being shut down in 2010 by order of President Obama, Sandia Labs has said the Precambrian granites of the Lake Superior region are the most stable region of granite outcrops in the United States. So this is 2011. This is the most recent evaluation from the primary Department of Energy contractor. Walker has been non-discriminatory as far as accepting campaign contributions from whatever powerful lobby exists, whether it be the mining industry to change Wisconsin mining laws or the nuclear power industry to change Wisconsin's nuclear moratorium. The ALEC, the Legislative Council, which organizes the introduction of legislation to promote corporate interests, has also been a major backer of the attack on the nuclear moratorium in Wisconsin. So there are plenty of legislators that have received funding from both the Nuclear Energy Institute as well as ALEC to overturn citizen concern about nuclear safety and nuclear power. Yucca Mountain was going to be, the only considered nuclear waste repository, and of course, one of the requirements of a federal repository is that there can't be the possibility of groundwater entering into or exiting the facility, and so the hydrologists that were employed by the federal government to study groundwater flows around the Yucca Mountain site documented that there were, in fact, even though it's a desert environment, there were still groundwater flows into the deposit, and they were told by their superiors to doctor the information so that it would conform to the criteria of the Department of Energy. That was one of the reasons why the Yucca Mountain site was eventually abandoned. There are other reasons too. It's a volcanic, it's subject to volcanic activity. There are earthquakes there. But one of the other reasons is that the scientific staff was compromised in their corruption of promoting a nuclear waste repository because that was what the nuclear industry told them was the priority. And so if it could happen at Yucca Mountain, where you have the most federal oversight, you can be certain it's going to happen in the Wolf River Bathlift. They're going to tell us that even though there are cracks and fissures there, that those cracks and fissures are not going to be the pathways for the groundwater to get in or come out. We're going to be told, in other words, more and more lies. I mean, anytime you mine uranium, you're exposing workers and the community to radon gas, which results in lung cancer epidemics, which we now are experiencing in Navajo country. There are massive tailings or tailings from uranium mining. Only for a ton of rock that comes out of the ground in New Mexico in the sandstone deposits, only 3 pounds of that ton ends up as yellow cake or usable uranium. 1,997 pounds of the rock ends up as waste, and that waste contains radioactive elements, dozens of radioactive elements, which continue to emit radiation over thousands of years. Thorium-230 is one of the emitters in those tailings piles, and there are miles and miles of these tailings piles in the Shiprock and the Grants uranium area in New Mexico that are emitting radiation into the environment, into the groundwater, and the solution that Los Alamos National Labs has come up with to solve the problem of radon emissions over thousands of years in the local environment is to fence off these areas as unfit for human habitation. Right? These are the lands of the Navajo, the Pueblo, and the other communities in the area of these tailings facilities. Tailings are, by volume, the largest source of radioactive emissions. And in fact, the largest nuclear waste accident that occurred was not 3 Mile Island in the United States. It was the Church Rock tailings dam failure in 1979, which released hundreds of millions of tons of radioactive effluent from those tailings ponds or these tailings facilities into the Rio Puerco River, which serves the drinking water and the irrigation water for the Navajo and the Pueblo Indians. Before we conclude, let me plug the most recent issues of the Nukewaste paper, and John LaForge is here in the back if you want to get copies. I assume you have copies.
We still have 12. They got handed out. I think people should have them. We have 12.
Oh, okay. There are articles in the most recent couple of newsletters about how the Nuclear Energy Institute engineered the passage or the overturn of the nuclear moratorium. There's also an excellent article on the test drilling for radwaste in North Dakota and South Dakota, where they're trying to drill a 3-mile hole in the ground, 17 inches in diameter, as an experimental model of how they might inject waste canisters 3 miles below the ground in the granite bedrock. North Dakota rejected the test drilling. South Dakota is now in the process of organizing opposition to it. But the Department of Energy clearly is going ahead full steam with this idea of underground granite disposal. Thank you all for coming. We're at the end of our time, and I'll be here.